Good evening, and thank you for joining Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in this month of October for our Hearing History, Seeing Activism, a series of programs that consider the unheard narratives in our congregations and our communities. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the World Mission Initiative, Continuing Education, Miller Summer Youth Institute, Metro Urban Institute, the Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry, the Kelso Museum, the Office of Field Education, the Office of Alumni Relations, and our Barber Library. As we welcome our new president, Dr. Asa Lee, whom you will meet in a moment, we invite you to add your voice to this conversation. We focus on the local, national, and international stories that shape who we are. This evening, we welcome back Dr. Kimberly Hill, who will be in conversation with President Lee. My colleague, Dr. Hunter Farrell, will provide a more substantial introduction to our guests in just a few moments. And we encourage you to view the whole list of October events. A quick link to the calendar is available on the PTS homepage at www.pts.edu. My name is Helen Blyer, and I have the privilege of serving here at PTS as our Director of Continuing Education. Before we begin with our program, I'd like to remind you of a few housekeeping details. We are meeting, as you can tell, in webinar, which of course means that the only people you can see are the presenters on camera. If you have questions that arise during our session, please include them in the Q&A pod, which appears at the bottom of your computer screen. And please use that only for questions that you might have. We'll have ample time for Q&A at the end. And I'm concerned that if you put your questions in the chat pod, they might get lost. Please use the chat pod to robustly comment on our talk, to communicate with your other friends on off screen, and generally engage with the presentation. In fact, why don't you give it a test drive right now? You can say hello, give your name, and tell us where you're viewing this from. So please open up the chat pod and let us know that you're here. For those of you who would benefit from this service, please note that Zoom has a new feature. It's closed captioning, or as we would also call it, live transcription. It's already been activated. To view it, simply click on the button at the bottom of your screen. It's automatically turned on for people who are mobile users. And remember, tonight is part 2 in our McClure Lectures series. All registrants should have received a link to last week's recorded session. We invite you to use these and other recordings that we have archived with your church adult ed programs, your book group, or any other gathering that might find this useful and interesting. And now I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Dr. Hunter Farrell, who is the director of the World Mission Initiative, our program partner for this event. He'll introduce our guests and moderate our Q&A this evening. Hunter, it's good to see you.
Thanks, Helen. Great to be with you and with all our guests. I'm thrilled to see all the different places around God's earth that are participating tonight. Welcome to each and every one of you. I'm thinking about a proverb that the celebrated Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe noted in an interview in Paris. He quoted a West African proverb in this way. He said, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." We know the history of Christian missions is no stranger to this phenomenon. Much of our collective memory of what God has done in mission around the world was crafted from the diaries, letters, and reports of white missionaries, mission executives, and others. But tonight we seek to engage in a practice committed to us by the Presbyterian Church's Brief Statement of Faith, which was adopted in 1991. It says these words: "In a broken and fearful world, the Spirit gives us courage to pray without ceasing, to witness among all peoples to Christ as Lord and Savior, to unmask idolatries in church and culture, to hear the voices of peoples long silenced, and to work with others for justice, freedom, and peace. I'm Hunter Farrell. I work at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's World Mission Initiative, which is given the blessed task of connecting our students with what God is doing in the world. And then from those learnings, bringing those learnings back home to Pittsburgh, to Western PA, Eastern Ohio, and the many contexts in which our students will serve. In the 21 years of the life and ministry of this World Mission Initiative, we have sent more than 580 students to more than 57 countries in the world. We're grateful for that, and it has served as a life-changing experience for many of our students. Tonight, we gather for the W. Don McClure Lecture on Mission and Evangelism. We're gathering on this virtual platform tonight, and we're glad for your presence here, because together we're going to be listening to the voices of peoples long silenced, the voices of African-American missionaries whose accounts and perspectives were not often included in official histories. Many in our audience know that Reverend McClure was a missionary who knew no borders. In an era when most missionaries never left the country to which they were assigned, McClure focused on an entire people group, the Anuak people of westernmost Sudan and easternmost Sudan and westernmost Ethiopia. They straddled that Sudanese-Ethiopian border, and he understood them as a people group and reached out to them in service for many years. McClure graduated from Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and immediately volunteered to teach at a school in Khartoum, Sudan. After he graduated from Pittsburgh Seminary, he returned to Sudan with his wife, Lida, and began new work in 1938 among the Anuak people, breaking several different protocols and traditions within the Presbyterian Church to establish direct relationships between local congregations and the Anuak people. During his storied career, his storied career was the subject of a biography by our own Pittsburgh Seminary professor of church history, Dr. Charles Partee, when he was a faculty member here. These stories of a celebrated life are a part of the received text of mission history. We can read about it in published accounts in many places. But tonight we want to focus on and listen with two colleagues who will lead us in a new direction. They've worked hard in their careers to seek out, to listen, and to foreground the voices of peoples long silenced. With us tonight are Dr. Kimberly D. Hill, a historian of African-American missions and Black internationalism, who teaches at the University of Texas at Dallas. She got her PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I first heard Dr. Hill speak at Montreat, North Carolina, arguably the epicenter of at least Southern Presbyterianism, and she gave a beautiful and chilling account of the story of the origins of the American Presbyterian Congo mission, and her gracious and factual way of dealing with that difficult history won many friends and turned many of us back to our history books to better understand our own church's histories. So I'm very grateful that Dr. Hill is with us tonight. She's the author of a book that I'd highly recommend, A Higher Mission, The Careers of Alonzo and Althea Brown Edmiston in Central Africa. It's highly recommended by me and several others who have read that and enjoyed it quite a bit. Dr. Hill, we welcome you and are grateful for your presence with us tonight. We also want to welcome the 7th president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, elected just last spring. He began work in June and has joined us on campus since that time. Dr. Lee, Dr. Asa J. Lee, came to Christ as a teenager after having been born in Suffolk, England. He's a dedicated theological educator and believes strongly in education as a vehicle for expanding one's view of the world. I know when I heard Dr. Lee interview for the position last spring, when he said the words that one of the first tasks that he would set for himself if he were to be selected as the president of Pittsburgh Seminary was to go across the street and talk to the principal and others at Obama High School. I knew that he was a friend of mission, because he understands that the task of mission and the work of the church doesn't extend merely to our four walls or to our comfortable campus with its iron gates, but rather extends across the street and across the world. So we're greatly blessed and honored to have him tonight as an interlocutor with Dr. Hill, and they'll be talking with us this evening, helping us to hone our ears onto the voices of people's long silence. Dr. Hill, Dr. Lee, we welcome you this evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very glad to be joining you again.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Hunter and Helen, for those introductions and the good work that you are doing in WMI and continuing ed. Good evening, everyone. We're excited to have this wonderful dialogue and conversation. I'm excited to be here. And just so you all know, I did meet with the principal across the street just a month or so ago. And so we've started a wonderful relationship there. But I'm excited to be with you all, but particularly thank you to Dr. Hill for the opportunity to hear from you both last week and then again on tonight about history, and not just history as broadly construed as a thing, but history constructed as a product of society and as a product of people. Mm. And so I'm excited to sort of walk down this interesting road of a construction of history. So today, those of you who are joining, Dr. Hill and I entered into a study session together, if you will. When I started looking at her good work around raising voices that have otherwise been silenced in the construction of history, what came to mind was a text first published in 1995 and republished in the early 2000s entitled "Silencing the Past." And we both have our copies, so you know that we actually did do our homework and we studied together. Power and the Production of History, a book by Michelle Rolfe Truleau. Let me say a few words about Truleau and then some words about the text. Truleau was a Haitian American and was born during the era of the Duvalier dictatorships in Haiti, and spent much of his time as a Haitian wrestling and struggling with the trauma of a dictatorship in the mid 20th century in Haiti, but later immigrated to America and became a scholar of history, having matriculated both at Johns Hopkins and worked at Chicago, at the University of Chicago, as well as Yale University. And so became a scholar of history, but his field was actually anthropology. And he had this wonderful sort of curious intersectional discipline. So he was an anthropologist, but he studied specifically the phenomenon of history and the construction of history. And his area was sort of peeking in the spaces and the places and the holes of history and the ways in which history leaves out voices. And so his key work, I think, in his life was this text, Silencing the Past. And here is his central thesis and argument about the construction of history in the West. And in 5 short chapters, he lays out through both theory and then application of that theory, the way in which history reinforces, constructs and reinforces power, but also is a industry in and of itself throughout history, that it constructs, maintains, and promotes the concentration of power. And it does that in some very specific ways, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But looking at Dr. Hill's work and then having read Trullo first earlier in this year, I felt that there was some natural synergies. And so I proposed it to Dr. Hill for our conversation. She readily agreed. And you actually hadn't read the text either at that point. So it was a great discovery for both of us. And then we want to look at that more in depth. So tonight, our conversation is going to be around these points and the points that Trullo talks about. And we're going to lift those up and apply them to all sorts of ways. And then hopefully you can join in as well. So with that, we're going to jump right in. Dr. Hill, one of the first, the title of the book is Silencing the Past. And so as a historian reading his texts, what would you say in both Trullo's instance and your own, what are silences in the work of history?
I went back earlier today and I took note of 6 types of silences that Trullo mentions. And then later on, I'll talk about how I see some of them in missions history. So the first type of silence that resonated with me was when he said that certain events in history can be designated as unthinkable. Unthinkable meaning it's not so much that people are saying a certain event is wrong or right. It's that they don't think of it long enough to label it wrong or right, that it goes beyond the frameworks of how they can conceive history occurring. So then it's as if it didn't happen, as if that part of history is silenced. Another silence that he mentions early in the book is related in I guess I'll say a sneaky way, that certain unthinkable events, such as the one that he focuses on, the Haitian Revolution, they will either not get attention at all, or they will get a great deal of attention just as a stepping stone or as a marker pointing towards some other historical topic that's considered more valuable based on how we already interpret history. So the Haitian Revolution might get mentioned, but only as a way to understand French history, or to understand the development, the domination of the West. I noticed that he talked about the silence of historical events by discussing a balance. So I thought when I picked up the book that it was going to mainly be about facts of history being ignored. That's only half of the story. Sometimes facts of history can just get lost in a wave of details. And I think it was the opening chapter where he describes that process as happening with the history of the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. That some parts of that history just aren't discussed at all. Other parts are discussed so narrowly, knowing the type of hat Davy Crockett was wearing, that it just takes on a children's story quality, and it seems to lose some of its historical power.
So would you say that third one is sort of silencing by getting lost in the details intentionally?
Getting lost in the details to the point where it starts to seem irrelevant to even try to seriously study the topic.
Yeah.
And then some of the silencing comes through just automatic parts of the historical research process, parts that I participate in myself, that when you're going to be taking notes on sources, in my case, when I visited the Presbyterian Historical Society, I'm not going to be writing down literally everything that's in the document. I have to choose which parts seem most relevant, most significant, to the topic in mind for me. So that means some aspects of historical documents will be silent in what I wrote.
Yeah.
So some aspects don't appear in a higher mission. It's up to me to try to explain it still in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, the historical process has some choices built into it.
Yes.
And the choice itself eventuates in silence. Yeah.
The last silence that stood out to me towards the end of the book was Trudeau talking about academic publications in general and how the whole discipline can set parameters for what is silenced or not based on what historians deem to be what he called serious objects of research and what gets considered trivial information.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which is sort of when academic publications sort of center certain voices over others, this is the power piece that we are to, right? It centers certain voices, and because the University of X decides to base some research or base an idea or elevate a certain narrative, it creates it as a power center. So I kind of can answer my own question. I just want your opinion on this is, do silences in this way sort of support power and narratives of power and systems of oppression?
Trudeau would say the silences are part of the power.
Yeah.
They're just how we see the power at work. And yeah, I agree with that theory of it. I think being a professional historian makes me pay attention to that more than I would otherwise. Just the literal process of pitching a book to academic presses, getting it reviewed by my senior colleagues, getting positive reviews, and then getting the green light to go forward to publication. All of that is the steps when I am waiting to hear from the gatekeepers, to be exposed to the power in my profession and to see which levels I'm going to be allowed to access.
Which is sort of the way in which that is the production, right? That's the historical production that then replicates the power that he's talking about there. So that's kind of the broad sort of way in which Trudeau deals with the topic. So now we drill a little deeper as it relates to your work in missions and history of missions. How in your view, how do Trudeau's silences shape the history of mission work and the stories that we've historically told about them?
So there's a lot that I could say to answer this one. I thought it made more sense to start by talking about the field of African American history.
Yeah.
Before I get into talking about missions history.
Great.
So before I could get into the field of missions history, I needed to start learning, even as an undergrad, about the production of African American history, because it's a relatively new field. And that gives those of us who study it the advantage of being aware continuously that there's power involved in what's considered history. So when I say that African American history is new, I'm referring to the interventions of founders of the field. Dr. Carter G. Woodson founding the first professional association, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He founded that in 1915. The first textbook of African American history, published in 1947, written by Dr. John Hope Franklin. So those milestones didn't mean that there were no African Americans anywhere doing things before those big events in history, before 1915, before 1947. The question was whether the activities of African Americans were going to be considered as significant, as worthy of consideration for shaping the history of the nation.
Yeah.
And the questions of what makes African American history significant, what continues to motivate people to study it, that controversy never goes away.
Mhm.
It wanes sometimes. It's back at its height.
Yeah.
This year. If anyone in our audience has been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the new African American Smithsonian, that whole museum is a historiographical argument. It's an effort to exercise power in promoting African American history by making steps with each exhibit to say, this is how African Americans contributed to the United States. Their contributions to the United States are what made their activities significant, valuable. This is why people should respect this field. This is why more people should be involved in it. So to try to bring this a little closer to missions history, if I was going to enter into this field with the idea of writing a dissertation that included African American missionaries, eventually writing a book that features the lives and careers of African American missionaries, first there had to be general consensus that the participation, the interests, the goals of African American missionaries were worthy of recognition or respect. That premise was not always there in missions history. And I'm not saying that to bring it down to a question of whether or not missions historians were exercising prejudice on a conscious level. The bigger issue was on unconscious decisions that had bearing on whether or not African American missionaries would get named and studied in scholarship. Unconscious decisions about who represents a denomination, who's considered leaders in a denomination, with which types of activities happening in another country are considered actual mission work, which activities are just things that happen to happen around a mission, which are considered significant, which are considered trivial.
Right.
And then, I'm going to mention a specific article because I think it helps point out silences in missions history much better than I could in a short period of time. So it's a 1994 article by Dana Robert, a professor of missiology at Boston. And the article's titled From Missions to Mission to Beyond Missions. It's from the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. And the different steps in the title indicate the trend through the first half of the 20th century to study missions history as the activities of denominations. That trend was not likely to include mentions of African American missionaries, because that trend is going to focus very heavily on those who were considered the organizers, the leaders, the planners of denominational activities. And it was less likely that African American missionaries would get an official leadership role in a denomination. Those who had official leadership roles are more likely to be in an African American denomination, which was, for various political reasons, probably going to be barred from overseas missions through much of the 20th century. So they would be considered trivial for lack of large numbers or large presence overseas. The next step, she talks about the study of missions history going more to a unified sense, thinking about missionaries as symbolizing a link to imperialism or a link to Western nationalism, and thereby being judged by whether or not they endorsed imperialism, how they may have directly or indirectly contributed to the oppression of people in other countries. The way that stage in missions history perpetuated silence was that, kind of like Trullo says with the Haitian Revolution, talking about missionaries as being part of an imperial project, it can draw a lot of attention. There's many people who have opinions about it. And it will make people think that they're talking about missions based on their interest and concern for non-Western countries, for the places that were colonized. But what it didn't lead to for most of the 20th century was a growth in interest in actually finding out about the lives of people outside of the West. So it drew attention, it started discussion, but it's still, even with all of the extra discourse mentioning Asia, Latin America, Africa, what was left out was most efforts to try to get to know people from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, because the focus was still on thinking, were these Western people doing the right thing or the wrong thing? What did these Western people represent?
Yeah.
So my stage in missions history is the beyond missions part, thinking about the details, the activities, the people who missionaries might have overlooked, and changing our own perspectives as the authors, as the researchers. Why focus on what the missionaries were doing? Why keep the focus on whether the missionaries were right or wrong, when there could be other valuable questions out there, other questions that start with focusing on non-Western people?
Yeah, that is a great synopsis of both your sort of approach to history as it relates to Trullo, but also the journey a bit of how you arrived where you were through the African American history and what has happened there. Listening to you, one of the things that I don't think I shared with you was, when I first read this text, I also was reading a book by Willie James Jennings of Yale University entitled The Christian Imagination, in which, in many respects, Jennings, who is a theologian, not necessarily a historian, actually sort of is positing a similar question of unearthing the silences, but from a theological sense of why are we, what have we built, what is the power that we've created theologically by using history in a certain kind of way. And so he takes all of these historical elements that are known, but then says, not only is power constructed sort of socially and politically, nation state building in Henry the Navigator and creating sort of conquests from Western Europe, but he also says alongside that there's a void that's being filled around theology. so that theology is a part of the power construct that history creates side by side. And so for many of us who are on this call, who are in churches and religious leaders, I don't want to just say power abstractly, right? It's not just some amorphous thing, but it's also, it shows up, particularly in the West, in theology, in how we centered the Western Church. When we talk about history, we don't center the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the oldest continuing form of the Christian practice. We don't center those other voices as a part of our Christian witness. And so I'll come back to sort of the implications around that. But listening to you talk about the way this shows up, particularly in mission work, it comes to mind that theology, political social power, and this construction of history are all conspiring in the missionaries going forward. And there's theology happening in real time by centering the missionary and not the Asian, the African, the Latin American in those narratives there. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. As I said earlier, Trullo uses anecdotes and exemplars from history. He talks about Christopher Columbus. He talks about Haitian history. He talks about examples from the Alamo as ways of sort of illustrating the theory that he's talking about. What, in your view, may be some stories that illustrates a similar arc of power and this dynamic of power in silence from your own work as a historian?
There was one main story about the American Presbyterian Congo Mission that's famous. And it was the discursive framework that I had to learn to understand, interpret, and eventually critique if I was going to contribute something unique with the book on the Congo Mission. So the famous story is about the human rights campaign against King Leopold II of Belgium. I gave some details and a couple of photographs about it in my last talk. The famous narrative within this story is that the Congo Mission had two leaders, one white named Reverend William Morrison, and one African American named William Henry Shepherd, who worked together to find witnesses and photographic evidence of torture that was being committed against African people in Congo at the behest of King Leopold and his rubber company. They publicized this in cooperation with British human rights activists. They helped continue a global human rights campaign, the very first, and they were successful in winning a libel suit against the Belgian government that was brought by the Belgian government, which then hastened the departure of King Leopold as the sole owner of the Congo Free State. The silences that confront me in that narrative had first to do with Reverend Shepherd himself. So I noticed that in some accounts, Reverend Shepherd's role is kind of minimized, even though he took the photographs that became significant evidence against King Leopold. It wasn't so much the minimization of Shepherd's role that proved an initial obstacle to my research as the limits being placed on what was considered significant about his role. That very, very much was made of the work that he did gathering evidence in the early 1900s and then going to this trial in 1909 and then retiring from the Congo mission a little later that year. So much emphasis was put on that it took me much longer to start to think about it from his perspective, to think about what Shepard had lost in being ordered to go into a very dangerous situation, taking photographs of people who were killing many people in heinous ways. What he lost by being told to retire, just as the mission station that he had founded was getting new reinforcements, just as more African-American missionaries were about to enter the field. The Edmistons were going to come back and help expand his mission station. And how he lost some of what he considered his professional reputation by shifting to starting a church in Louisville, Kentucky, and becoming known more for writing children's books and for helping to bolster a mission to African Americans moving to the city, rather than being able to maintain his reputation as an international leader, as an explorer. So those are questions that, even though I've now written a book, I'm still wrestling with my own mindset to try to fully embrace his perspective on how working in the slums of Louisville, Kentucky, running what was called the Church for the Colored Mission, how he could turn that into an extension of what had made him a very famous international leader at one point. So regarding the later career of William Henry Shepard, that's one silence that came to mind that is especially evident because he was especially the most famous African-American missionary there. And thank you to Reverend Angela Johnson. She's the current pastor of Grace Hope Church, the church that Reverend Shepard founded in Louisville. So other silences, things that I noticed as years on as I continued this project, the attention to the Human Rights Campaign, it makes the Congo mission, it fits the Congo mission into narratives of Western activity very well. And it also fits into the mission studies tradition of focusing on what denominations were doing. It draws attention away from the links between the Congo mission and the US South and Southern culture. The link that proved most useful for me while writing this book was to think about the fact that the Congo mission very, very much wanted to start a cotton plantation.
Wow.
And was very, had an agricultural specialist who was very sure that it could happen partly because of the denomination's history as a Confederate institution. And it's the fact that it included former slave owners. And with the idea that Alonzo Edmiston, as somebody who had worked on a plantation earlier in life, could possibly be a natural fit to be an assistant on a cotton plantation, no matter where it was in the world. So the records for that are not as publicized as the history of the Human Rights Campaign, but they turned out to be central to thinking about how the Congo mission related to Belgian authorities after the Human Rights Campaign ended. I wouldn't have noticed that much if I hadn't been paying attention to Alonzo Edmiston and to the fact that he kept reporting over and over again over the years that, yes, I'm being asked to grow cotton and to teach people to grow cotton. These people do not want to do this.
Mm.
Let's see. So I mentioned that there were growing diplomatic ties between the Belgian government and the Congo mission. Some of those diplomatic ties had to do with gaining access to land, such as the land to start a cotton plantation. Some of those ties involved the African-American missionaries. In the case of Alonzo Edmiston, his role includes helping to run a court to discipline African people who are accused of violating colonial policies. And he also helps with modeling agricultural plans that the Belgian authorities will eventually expand throughout the colony.
Mm-hmm.
Those details are much less likely to be publicized because they don't fit into that earlier narrative of the Congo mission standing against the Belgian authority, against Belgian oppression. But I needed to find that information to understand why the Congo mission was still expanding after the campaign, after the human rights campaign ended, how they managed to continue to get more stations, more land,
Mm-hmm.
how Alonzo Edmiston found ways to become, to wield some kind of diplomatic authority, to win awards from the Belgian government, and to use that to prove that he was a professional, an expert, that he belonged there, to help explain how he built a 30-year career at a time when almost all of his African-American colleagues were pushed out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and the silence that was especially important to me, and also required a lot more effort on my part than I showed during grad school, and effort that was difficult, but I'm proud of it. I couldn't understand the Congo mission if I didn't try to learn about the ongoing displacement and oppression of African people in the areas around the Congo mission.
Mm-hmm.
Even though missionaries wrote about it, it's generally not mentioned in most histories of the Congo mission, because it complicates the picture of the Congo mission joining a human rights campaign. King Leopold leaves, then everything gets better. Not so much.
Not right.
Yeah. And but that's where a lot of the Edmiston story was, with Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston being the ones who noticed the ongoing troubles that local people faced, and finding ways to recognize it, to express it, to try to help them improve their situations, and to still protest against Belgian authority in ways, even when it no longer seemed advantageous to do so.
Right. Well, I have lots of thoughts. The foremost is that you're a professional historian. So, I mean, history is a complex sort of web of multiple constructs that when you talked about sort of running into sort of the intersection of, Southern plantation interests, and sort of that's showing up in the form of trying to get these folks to grow and be cotton farmers. It really speaks to just how, when you follow the personal narratives of folks, how that can, in a way, sort of expose the silences of why things are happening, right? So if you just look at a high level, okay, why in the world is this important? Why are they trying to force this issue with people? Well, because there's a thread running there that has been silenced in some way, and silenced in part because power is sort of telling you not to see that and moving away from that in that way. And again, what comes to mind is the biblical narrative, the way in which both theology and biblical history sort of have embedded in them the voices of silence, the voices of those who are glaringly silenced, right? The most obvious that comes to mind is that we never get the side of the Egyptians in the Exodus story, who are silenced by plagues, right? And so then, there's a sort of no one wants to be the Egyptian, so we don't need to talk about it. But yet, if it's an event that's happened, then we've got to wrestle with it in a way that's meaningful. But in biblical history, we spend a lot of time thinking about things like midrash and other commentaries to kind of unpack these silences that are otherwise, these gaps in the stories that help. So in many ways, that's, I see part of your work in telling this story as being a form of sort of unpacking those silences in structural ways. But that what we blame the biblical writers for, of leaving voices out, we still do today. and those have consequences that we have responsibility to address in sort of either uncovering those narratives or thinking back through those narratives. So thank you for that. I don't know if you want to say anything in response to that.
I very much appreciate the way that you put it. I just follow up to say that there's always something extra to learn.
Yeah.
That the silence or the assumption that a detail or a group of people are irrelevant or easily overlooked, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have nothing to contribute.
Precisely.
Possibly more.
Right.
Because they could shift our perspective.
I think I think that is the most revelatory piece, is that listening to the people that have been overlooked often takes you in a whole new direction because you've been wrestling with why is a thing the way it is. But talking to, and I'll use an example for myself in my sort of experience of being a pastor. Later, I've got one more question I want to ask you, but I'm going to come back to that. By listening to the overlooked person, you actually get a nugget that actually explains so much of the ritual or so much of why things might be the way they are in that life. So last question, I'm asking your professional opinion on us as Christian thinkers and leaders. As a historian, what are the ways that we can give voice to the silences that we run into in our lives and contexts as Christian leaders who lead in congregational life or in other settings? We're running up against silences all the time.
Yeah.
When we see, I'll use a specific example, when we see some histories of congregations, for example, and there's this gap that Pastor so-and-so came and pastor for 25 years, and then the next line is, then Pastor so-and-so came, right? Well, what happened in those 25 years, and why don't we want to talk about that? So there's silences that we run into all the time. What are some ways that you feel we can give voice to the silenced in our own contexts?
I thought about answering this question more as a congregant and as somebody who approaches my professional work through a Christian lens.
Yeah.
So to borrow part of what I learned from Dr. Kenneth Wu's class last week, to practice my faith in my discipline, I also need to accept responsibility for recognizing the humanity, the kinship of people in the past who have been overlooked. That I have a spiritual responsibility to notice them, to agree that they mattered, to identify their work, their contributions, and to point out where they fit into community, the community of their lifetime, but also the community of historical figures, the community of people who are recognized as worthy of being remembered. To think about how people can do that in practice, I thought that you can start by asking why certain surprising aspects of history seem surprising, especially when you're looking around your own city, around your own church. If something strikes you as different, unusual, you take the time to ask why, what seems controversial about it, or flip side, what makes it seem irrelevant, what makes it seem easy to overlook.
Yeah.
Why do people not seem interested in discussing this, even though it's different? When you identify that, then I'm borrowing a phrase from another professor here. So my mentor in grad school was the missions historian Grant Wacker, and he'd always ask us the "so what" question.
Yep.
So you gotta get used to asking yourself the "so what" question. What difference does it make to you or to your community if these unusual historical details get known more widely? And what is the status quo that's being challenged? Well, what's at the root of this desire if people seem to want to protect the status quo from this type of history?
Right. That's the power question. Yeah.
That's when you can start to make that invisible power a little easier to spot.
Right. Because it has a way of showing its head when you challenge the status quo that's there.
But the power of the status quo is in it not seeming like a big deal, not seeming like something that you need to discuss, because it's just there. So you have to ask enough questions to maybe even put yourself outside of it for a bit.
Yeah.
So you can observe it.
Yeah. That's funny because as the new president, I am sort of an objective observer of this kind of culture, and so I don't know what question I shouldn't ask, right? That exposes the status quo there. So yeah, you do have to kind of step out of your contextual embeddedness to be able to sort of see things that are operating, which is very difficult to do for some.
I had some advantages with my research because there are relatively few of us studying African American missionaries, and to do it, we straddle different fields. So I'm almost always feeling outside of some box.
Gotcha.
It makes it more difficult to know when something fits or how to put the pieces together. But on the other hand, it does make it easier for me to look from the outside.
Yeah. Because you feel like you're an outsider anyway, so you get to peek in on these things. if I may, I want to say a word to answer my own question, reflecting on both PTS and the context there, and then we might open it up to some of our questions that have been offered for us there. So for me, as a leader in theological education in a seminary, this question of power and the history we tell, kind of and unearthing it, kind of the three implications for PTS as an institution. The first one is exactly what you said, which is coming in and asking the question, why are things the way they are? And discovering that processes, procedures, and all sorts of traditions happen for a reason. And as I said, coming in new, I don't know what question I shouldn't be asking. So I ask a question, and the narrative can be one of several things, right? There is the stated narrative that is sort of the codified reason. Then there is sort of the personality-based reason that says, well, that's what was said, but really what happened was this. And so it was said this way because. And then there is sort of the institutionalized reason, right? It needed to be that way because it had to fit in a larger system. And I think asking that question is equally as important for churches and religious leaders in religious communities, because we all run into the cultural things that happen in our churches and in our communities of faith. And so there's the story, then there is the reason behind the story, which usually centers around a group of people or a person. And then there is the reason why it became the story and why it was enacted. And so I think everything from ritual to tradition to the rhythms of a community are all rooted in that question. So we've got to ask, well, who was meant to be represented in this ritual, and why or why not? Which leads me to the second point is, we at PTS are in a part of a larger ecosystem, which is the field of theological education. And in theological education, there are all sorts of changes that are happening, but a lot of those changes are stemmed from reactions to who was not at the table when the professionalization of training, theological training, took place in the 19th and 20th century. So everything from who are students to what is the church, right? Those were defined by very specific groups of people. Theological education for much of the 20th century, and definitely the 19th century into the 20th century, was a white male-dominated area. And so who was answering those questions were a very specific group of people. As we begin to wrestle with the future of theological education and the decentering of a lot of things in Christian practice, we've got to also ask, what is a student again? Yeah. Who defined that? Who's represented as a student and who isn't? What is the church, which is, I think, a generational question that we always have to wrestle with. And what is ministry? How is ministry different from church? And all of those things are important, but there have been silences built along the way to be able to do that. And the last thing is, how do we tell the story of our mission that includes people that have otherwise been silenced over time? And I think that's another dovetail to church life and what churches are wrestling with, because this is the same kind of question of why haven't we connected with our community, or who are the people that we overlooked that were a part of our community that we didn't really engage. So what do you think about my application of those sort of takeaways from Trulo and listening to you?
Those sound like excellent takeaways and very, very practical as well.
Well, I hope they are become that for us here at PTS. I'm going to turn it back to Hunter, who kind of will help us to navigate this Q&A period. So Hunter, show is yours.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Dr. Lee and Dr. Hill, there's a lot of questions both on the Q&A format, and some folks are texting me questions. You've struck some chords. And let's get current. Let's speak to, in the last couple of years and even in the last week, think about the shift from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So one narrative that was heard and fortified, culturally speaking, for almost a century in US history, there's a shift going on. At the same time, we're seeing currents of cultural resistance to proclaiming unheard histories, to seeing those, as you said, I think very sensitively, Dr. Hill, to notice them. What do you see going on? What's the Spirit doing among us now? Because we see both movements towards a deeper listening to the silenced voices and a massive pushback. What do you make of that?
Regarding Columbus Day, I see growing recognition of the long-term impacts of disease, economic oppression, slave trading, genocide, and that the sentiments behind pushing for Indigenous Peoples Day don't all necessarily have to do with a rejection of Columbus, so much as increasing connections, communication among people who have been impacted by genocide, disease, economic oppression, and are looking for more acknowledgement of those as problems that need alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Can I jump in real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
Trullo has a whole chapter dedicated to Columbus. And I'm going to read just a quick portion of it because I have it marked because I love it. It's on page 115, Dr. Hill, if you want to.
I do.
He says, he's summarizing his argument here, but what he says is, for the reasons above, I prefer to say that Columbus, quote, stumbled on the Bahamas, end quote, or, quote, discovered the Antilles, end quote. And I prefer the term conquest over discovery to describe what happened after the landing. Such phrasings are awkward and may raise some eyebrows. They may even annoy some readers, but the awkwardness and the fact that the entire issue can be dismissed as trivial quibbling suggests that it is not easy to subvert the very language describing the facts of the matter. For the power to decide what is trivial and annoying is also part of the power to decide how what happened becomes that which is said to have happened, which is a real distinction there. And so I love that phrasing because it kind of summarizes sort of a twofold move that's happening. One is to try to decenter Columbus, which I think, Dr. Hill, what you're talking about there is to elevate that there are other people in the world that matter, and it decenters Western Europe. But the other is to say that what we describe and what we've named for centuries is just not the facts of the matter at all. And so the elevation of the day itself, which Trullo does an excellent job of naming as a product of sort of a very different political agenda in the late 19th and early 20th century, this is a reaction to all of that.
I see a connection to current events with the debate over the 1619 Project and debate over critical race theory in the sense that these debates will specifically mention history, but are really arguing over emotions about the values that are being placed on emotions and the so what, the significance of the history.
Yeah.
And in the case of critical race theory debates, the emotional controversy is over whether the anticipated shock and shame of learning about these certain controversial events, whether that anticipated shock and shame will outweigh the accumulated pain and grief of the legacies of these events, legacies that are no less painful for the fact that they aren't being discussed. And since people have different emotions at different times, there's not going to be a simple answer to which side of the debate is stronger.
That's helpful, Dr. Hill. Reverend Sylvia Wilson of the Mariah Fearing Fund offers this question. Did you have the opportunity to speak with current African-American mission personnel about the ways the history continues to impact and influence the present in the Congo and elsewhere on the continent? In other words, were you able to continue that from I think the 1930s up to the 1930s is the particular period that you've been focusing on in your work? Have you had the opportunity to speak to more recent mission workers currently in service or recently?
I have had the opportunity to speak with currently serving African-American missionaries, one of whom I met through the Overseas Ministry Study Center, one of whom is the granddaughter of Alonzo and Althea Brown Edmiston.
Wow.
That sister, sorry, my brain has to switch gears for a minute. I apologize. Sister Evelyn Edmiston Easton.
Mm-hmm.
She became a missionary to Africa, and she considers it as part of the legacy of her grandparents. And I've also met by email the director of the Professional Association for African American Missionaries. I'll see if I can look up the name and I'll put it in the chat.
Beautiful.
But the people I mentioned, they were not serving in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the information that I have about current events in DRC has come from meeting ministers, especially when I attended the Congo Mission Network meeting in Montreat, and also from watching videos that come from the Presbyterian Church of the Congo, videos that were posted online and on YouTube. So yeah, I have had the honor of meeting current church members and leaders from there, but I have not yet met African-American missionaries working in DRC. Would very much like to go myself someday.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I'm just recalling that was, I think it was like August of 2017, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps 2016.
That was 2016.
2016.
I was just starting the first chapter of my book.
Wow. Wow. Well, I remember, I mean, how so the 350, 400, I think all white former missionaries to the Congo, or the children of missionaries to the Congo. There may have been a few African Americans there. I'm recalling it was overwhelmingly white, the audience. And you didn't contest the received history of the APCM, the American Presbyterian Congo Mission. Everyone in the room knew it. I mean, it's like the back of our hands. We knew this stuff, right? The received history as power has shaped it and reproduced it for us. You deftly you definitely proposed a well-documented alternative version that painfully made all the sense in the world, that the APCM was born, in fact, as a way to open a door to empty a couple of southern states, Alabama and Mississippi, the Black Belt, as so-called, of its overpopulation, as described by 2 US representatives, to get freed slaves back to Africa, because the demographics were suddenly weighing on them, and they recognized what was coming down the pike for white supremacy in their political contexts. And you deftly wove this history for us, using appropriate documentation, to where, I mean, the dissonance in the room was painful, and you engaged folks. People then wanted to know more, and you sent all of us back to our history books, because you're very kind in your description, that sanitized history that we have been reading, that has been published. There's a painful underpinning to that. So can you say a word about that? Is that, I mean, is that a way to do this? You're in a sense suggesting to us a style of juxtaposing, bringing, here's another read of the history, and maybe even turning it over to those folks for them to speak for themselves. Does that make sense?
That's the way that I enjoy teaching my courses.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of filtered naturally into how I talk about my research, that the best way to get a history student engaged, especially if they're entering a class that's required and they'd much rather be somewhere else, you give them a surprise.
Mhm.
And that will make them motivated to try to reconcile that surprise with what they already know, or to find out more information that might just change their perspective. When they get motivated to find their own information, that's when they go from student in required class to somebody who has the potential to love history. And somebody who understands history as a process. So that's my general take on it. Regarding the Congo Mission Network specifically, I knew that I was coming in as a guest, and that I was going to meet people who had much more in-depth personal knowledge of the Congo mission than I knew. I didn't expect I was going to meet people who actually had met Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston. That was a real treat to get their stories. But to be able to get those stories, I have to be open. I have to present myself as a learner, as well as somebody who has analyzed this documentation, somebody who has a message to present, but also I recognize that message isn't everything. There's more for others to do. There's a lot more to say about why it matters. And some of those answers of why it matters can only come from the people who are personally involved.
Beautiful. Questions come to us, and Dr. Hill and Dr. Lee. Would Trouillot consider the situation with the 10,000 Haitians being sent back to Haiti as an event in history that will eventually be seen as unthinkable, using that first category of silences that Trouillot sees?
I'll throw that question to you first, Reverend Lee.
I should have said in my introduction of him that Trouillot died rather tragically. I want to say sometime in the 20-teens. I can't think of the date. 2012, 2013, I believe. We can find that out. Correct me. You all can Google and correct me on that. But he saw the ongoing saga of, in his writings, he saw the ongoing saga of the way in which the West treated Haiti as a continual silencing of Haiti at all levels. So, and it all, I think, and Dr. Hill, I'd be interested to have your opinion on this. I think everything that has happened in Haiti since the revolution has been unthinkable, quote unquote. Mm. And so because it is unthinkable, we don't really pay attention to it at all. It's the aberration. I mean, he has a very striking statement in there that for those of us who learned the age of revolutions, right? When we learned the 18th century being the latter half of the 18th century as the period and the age of revolutions. We talk about the French Revolution. We talk about the American Revolution, right? We do not include, up until maybe recently, I didn't learn it this way as a school age child. We didn't include Haiti as a part of the revolutions to be talked about, even though it is the most inconsequential in the Western Hemisphere, in that if you don't have a Haitian Revolution, it's arguably you don't have a Louisiana Purchase, which is the reason the Louisiana Purchase exists, to pay for the debts of losing, I think 3 times the French naval fleet in trying to recover Haiti. So you can't tell a part of American history if you don't include the Haitian Revolution, and yet we somehow find a way to call it unthinkable. And so every event that has happened from that point to, I think of the news coverage of the language of the earthquakes, right? It is unthinkable, the newscasters say, that another earthquake has hit. In another phrase that's common to talk about Haiti, the Western Hemisphere's poorest nation, right? Right. It's unthinkable that the prosperous West would have such a, right. All of those are just continual there. Thank you, Helen. He dies in 2012. But yeah, so I would say it's all of it, but I'm interested in your opinion on that, Dr. Hill.
Trelot contrasts his efforts to highlight the history of the Haitian Revolution with the dominant framework, which he summarizes as a narrative of Western dominance. So my first thoughts for answering the question would be that if the footage of people from Haiti getting pushed by people on horseback back into the Rio Grande River, of suffering from earthquakes, of being in under-resourced refugee camps, if that footage does not directly challenge or complicate people's framework for thinking about Western dominance, then it's not going to be considered unthinkable. It's not going to be considered a challenge. So how do we tell whether or not it changes that framework of Western dominance? Trelot drew attention to the fact that the Haitian Revolution, in some cases, literally couldn't be talked about because leaders didn't want news of a successful slave rebellion spreading around the world while slavery remained legal. So the focus on disasters, on oppression of Haitian people, if it helps to continue to make them seem vulnerable, then it is feeding into a broader narrative of Western dominance. Vulnerable or helpless.
Because it justifies the missionary impulse, which can pacify and serve as a smokescreen for political intrigue and domination and the colonial spirit. Wow. I'm thinking of Lillian Anthony, who was the first African-American woman who graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. She worked for a number of years at the national leadership of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I was in many meetings with her. We were on a planning committee for the Year with Africa, which the Presbyterian Church engaged in 1994-95. Lillian would often start a meeting at the Presbyterian Center looking around, everybody would be looking at her. She'd stop and she'd say, "Who's not represented here?"
Mm.
And just with that technique of starting the meeting, remembering the voices that have not been allowed to get this far, that can't put on the suit and tie or whatever to get to the table, that don't have the degree or whatever the barriers are. And it just served as so kind of piggybacking on Lillian's wisdom, what would you all say? What are some ways that we can engage our sessions, our church councils, our membership, our new members classes, to be more aware of voices long silenced around us? What advice would you give to leaders in the different communities represented on this platform with us tonight?
I really admire Reverend Lee's approach, that you can think about representing the underrepresented or unknown voices first by going out and seeing where they are. So meeting the people who are already in the community, but just aren't in communication with you, and go to where they are. Just observe as much as they are comfortable with, what they choose to do, who they choose to be with. And then over a longer period of time, think about ways that maybe you can forge connections. I think community connections bring a longer term potential of growth and stability than this numbers game of trying to count people of a certain type and recruiting individuals, hoping that they can find the fortitude to stay.
Yeah, I agree with that. To that first point about going out and seeing, I think this speaks to naming and elevating those silences and the voices who are not there, by going and having conversations with folks in the community who are not part of your church or your nonprofit or what have you. You are actually naming that they have their own history with you, with that place, right? So what are the stories that are told about your church? Is it simply a landmark, right? Go past the gas station and you'll see the Presbyterian church on the right hand side, make a left turn and you'll see the place, right? Is that the story? Is that the history that you have there? Or is it as I reflected on this work, is it the story of the church that was being patronizing during the era of segregation, the church in the South? And so they opened up their fellowship, not their fellowship hall, but their basement to have for the colored high school to have its prom, right? Not in the fellowship hall upstairs, but in the basement. And they thought they were the progressive church. We want to do that. And so the story that's now told in the community is not a positive one. It is, they were patronizing. They thought, they were doing us a favor by having the prom or the high school dance, I can't remember which one it was, in the basement as opposed to in the fellowship hall, because really we didn't want anybody being seen, any Black folks walking into the front door, right? What are the stories there? What are the lived histories? And something about churches is that you can very quickly in a church that is 150 years old, you can very quickly reach back from the present into that 150 years by simply talking to people. I served a congregation and it was 140 years old, and we had a member of our church who was 93. And she joined the church when she was 12, baptized when she was 12. And so sitting with her, I could cover almost over a century of the church's history just by sitting with her. And she could then remember from as a kid being told certain things sort of secondarily, that took her back, that I actually got more like 120, 130 years of a 140-year history of the church. And there are people right now sitting in our congregations who have that longevity and have that long memory, that you actually can find out a whole lot more than you think you could by just sitting and talking with them about their stories. And you're able to connect the stories. But also in the community, you can do the same thing, because there are people with that kind of longevity.
Beautiful, beautiful. Please, Dr. Hill.
Oh, sorry, that was excellent. I wasn't going to add more.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been a really rich conversation, and I think there's a missiological focus. It helps equip us to engage the community that God has placed around us. Thanks so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
You muted yourself there.
Thank you. I appreciate deeply the reminder to enter spaces with receptivity and curiosity. The theme for this month of programming has been hearing histories and seeing activism, which puts us into a receptive posture, and we're entering our communities to see what stories are not only the stock stories, the traditional histories that have been shared, but also the concealed stories and even the stories of resistance that are below the radar screen for many people. Thank you to Dr. Hill, Dr. Lee, and my colleague, Dr. Farrell, as well, for participating in such a great and thought-provoking conversation this evening. And I'd like to remind everybody who is in our on-screen community right now that these activities, these events will continue through the month of October. Next week, we have a Metro Urban Institute symposium that will focus on urban artistry, aesthetics, and social ministry. That will be Thursday, October 21st in the afternoon, 1 p.m. Eastern time. In the evening, we'll be hosting Janelle Austin, who is doing her own caretaking of history, particularly unheard stories, as the caretaker of George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is the anti-racism activist who is stewarding that space and teaching people how to not only exercise pastoral care to the individuals who come to that space as a site of pilgrimage, but she's also archiving and saving all of the memorabilia that people leave behind, calling it the lived history of the people who are most impacted by the movement that was significantly sparked by George Floyd's death. And I would like to remind folks as well that George Floyd would have been 48 years old tomorrow, October 14th. Finally, we have our Kelso Museum lecture on October 27th, The Risks and Rewards of Archaeology as Activism, another exploration into history and its activist possibilities. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us. The recording of this conversation will be available quite soon. We appreciate your participation in this. And again, Drs. Hill and Lee, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and candor this evening.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all, and thank you.